Welcome to the PGN Podcast.
With this podcast, we're looking to normalise the conversation around flooding, what happens behind the scenes, lifting the curtains, and the mystery that could sometimes come into play when you're either involved with flooding or trying to protect your home or business. We're talking to some experts within the industry and relaying some of the experiences we've heard from some communities around the region.
Hopefully, after our series, you'll have a bit more information to help yourself and others in an emergency where flooding is involved.
We have a diverse network of partners and friends, some of whom could not join us in person. This is a bonus episode where we catch up with some of them virtually. Welcome to the PGN Podcast. We have a new lovely guest, Jed Ramsay, project lead for Project Groundwater Bucks. Welcome, Jed. How are you?
Thank you, Meshi. Good to be here. I'm very well, thank you.
So, Jed, tell us a bit more about your groundwater project.
Yeah, so I'm leading Project Groundwater down in Buckinghamshire, and we cover the Chiltern Hills and Berkshire Downs. And the basic premise of the project is that groundwater flooding over the years, out of all the sources of flooding there are, it's the least well understood, it's the least well mapped, modelled, least well warned about, least well invested in. And Project Groundwater is really trying to address all of those problems, both locally in the Chilterns, but then to roll that out nationally.
Yeah, I think just building on that though, the funding that you also have is from the same source as we do. So it's under the FCRIP, the Flood Coastal Resilience Innovation Program. And which focus is to kind of promote innovation in kind of areas such as this, where there's very little data and very little evidence base to quantify groundwater flooding. Can you tell us about your objectives, really, what you're trying to achieve with this project?
Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right. I mean, the funding source that we've got from DEFRA and the Environment Agency is, in my experience, pretty unique, and given the opportunity to try new methods and innovate in new ways is a really great opportunity. Brings risks and challenges with it, of course, but it's given us a chance to try the ideas that we've had for years that you just couldn't get funding for before. And in terms of the objectives for the project, our overall vision is to forever change how groundwater flood risk is managed in the UK and abroad. And so it's quite an ambitious thing, but you start with small things. So, for example, you can't get hold of a set of national groundwater flood risk maps. Now, you can get hold of flood risk maps for surface water flooding, for coastal flooding, for flooding from rivers, but not groundwater. Now, why? It's just a gap that shouldn't exist. So that's the kind of challenge we want to try and address through Project Groundwater. And obviously working with yourselves as well is a really important part of that, and how we ensure we've got a legacy that remains after the projects are finished.
Yeah. So Jed, we talk about groundwater flooding here, and you've just mentioned rightly so about the surface water flooding maps, river, sea flooding maps. Do you feel like groundwater's got this? As a nation, we've got this out of sight, out of mind attitude towards groundwater at the minute.
Yeah, Carl, I think you're absolutely right there. When we talk about groundwater flooding, sometimes we call it the invisible flooding because it never makes the news. It's, it hasn't got that drama to it where it comes up, comes down. You look at some of the significant flood events we've had over the last decade, that they'll be in the news. They're in the headlines. There's, the kind of tragedy of them is very visible. Whereas groundwater flooding comes up slowly, stays there for a while, and it doesn't affect like cities. It affects like small, well, maybe a bit different for you guys, but down in the south where we are, it affects small pockets of places. Like you get a handful of houses that are affected.
Yeah, that's it, and kind of you haven't got that visual impact of a deluge or a river bursting its banks or something like that. But it's prolonged, it's almost permanent in some cases, and the mental health impacts are to residents or those affected, because people don't know how to get that to go away, but also people don't understand how it's occurring as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, again, that's an area that's just not researched or understood. So are the effects of groundwater flooding on people and their mental health, for example, is that more significant than a flood that comes up, stays there for 2 hours and then goes back down? Your house is still reflooded, but your recovery is a lot quicker when the flood comes and goes. When, like you say, when it stays there for weeks, months, I don't know, you can't use your bathroom for months, for example. The effects of this aren't haven't really been investigated, and that's one of the things we want to do as well.
Yeah. So just to get back to your own Project Groundwater in Bucks there, I think within our project, we've got a very good stakeholder group. Firstly, obviously, because of the relationship with the industrial heritage, the coal authority is one of them, but also as well, groundwater is impacted on a regional level. So, our stakeholders include neighbouring local authorities to the Gateshead area. So what about your own stakeholders? Who have you got involved, and sort of why are they important to your particular project as well?
Yeah, it's the stakeholders is a big challenge. So, recovery, we've got 6 local authorities in the partnership, and around 35 organisations in total as part of the project, and that's before you start thinking about the communities who are affected. So the approach we've taken is to choose 9 pilot communities that we know have a history of groundwater flooding, and to work with them more closely. But again, the range of engagement you get is really different from the ones with a really established flood action group who are very active and proactive and do their own schemes, for example, to other areas where there's nothing like that in place at all, and the awareness even of the flood risk is minimal. So what we're trying to do is obviously take different approaches to match those places, to try and, if we need to build engagement to do that, if we need to help for a flood action group to be set up, for example, that's one of the things we'd like to manage to achieve, because to me, that's really how you start to build resilience in a community, isn't it? When you get people together and you get them talking about the issues and understanding the problem to start with, you've got to have that as your base, haven't you?
Yeah.
I think building on what you touched on, Jed, there, an opportunity to make a change in a national scale. Just for our listeners, obviously, there is a third Project Groundwater, and that's Lincolnshire. And as part of this FCRIP, we've been able to kind of join up a little bit and create a bit of a working partnership to kind of share and bring that knowledge together. So you want to talk to us a little bit about what that partnership is and what it stands for?
Yeah, that's right, Meshi. I mean, we've got the 3 groundwater projects, each with a different local focus and slightly different local issues to address, principally due to the geology changes, if you like. I mean, that's the key difference. We're focusing on the chalk and river gravels. Lincolnshire have a bit of chalk and more limestone, and obviously you've got the mines that you're working with up in Northumbria. But the joy, of course, of having the 3 projects looking at groundwater is, one, that there's a significant resource there between the 3 projects, looking at very similar issues at the nub of it. So, for example, you talk about flood warning. There's no national flood warnings for groundwater, so we all need to build some form of way of warning people when the levels are rising. And then, how do you monitor it better? These are kind of similar issues, no matter where you are. And it's given us the opportunity really to collaborate then and think, are there areas where we can work together and where our aims align? So, for example, with Lincolnshire, we're starting some research into developing better property flood resilience measures. So again, poorly served with groundwater, you've got minimal options and usually very expensive options. So the idea, can we find a way to do this cheaper? Is there a different technology that could be used from another sector, for example? So these kind of building things together is a great result, really, of having the 3 projects in 3 different places.
I bet it also improves our chances, though, of creating these new national databases, because if we can develop systems that can talk to each other and integrate well with each other, then it gives us a better chance of getting something that could be used nationally, upscaled into other regions as well. And when you think about legacy, what does that look like for you, Jed?
Yeah, I mean, that is the big question, isn't it? And especially when you're leading an innovation project, you've really got to have legacy at the heart of what you're doing. So, I'd hope that we make some inroads into the local problems in the Chilterns throughout the time. But then, like you say, Meshi, how do you then scale that up to the other areas of the country that we know also suffer from the same problems? So, when you look at the chalk, it basically starts up at the Wash and then goes all the way down to Dorset. And that whole part of the country suffers from groundwater flooding associated with the chalk. Now, if we want to roll out what we're doing, we're not going to manage to do all the testing and trying out of things and then get it rolled out nationally within the time we have remaining. So the plans we've developed between us now are to leave an organisation behind that will survive the projects and be able to carry on what we've started. And that we're thinking to call that Let's Talk Groundwater Flooding. And it to be that independent voice, really, for people who are affected by the groundwater flooding, but also to be a centre of expertise, knowledge, and really the voice for change, because we're not going to resolve these issues not on a national level unless we make significant change to how the system's set up. But that's my personal view, after 20 years of working in flood risk management, that we deal well with flooding from rivers and coasts. We deal with that pretty well. Surface water and groundwater, I think you could say both, we don't deal with very well, and the system needs to change for us to do that better.
Yeah, I mean, Jed, obviously myself, I've worked for lead local flood authorities for 13 years, local government for a lot longer, and I think what I find here is there's an expectation that people who work for lead local flood authorities have expertise in certain things. And groundwater, as we've said already, is a bit of a dark art in essence. How do you think these projects can work to help upskill not just ourselves as lead local flood authorities, but other departments within councils and other risk management authorities we deal with? How important is it that we use these projects to upskill our own staff and those we work with?
Yeah, no, again, it's like, I feel that's just a big open door we'll be pushing through, because every local authority I speak with, the staff are like, oh, we'd be really interested in what you're doing there. We think we have groundwater flooding, even areas of the country where you would think traditionally you don't. So, for example, Lancashire approached me and said, well, we think we've got some groundwater flooding problems. I was like, oh, really? And when you think about it, you get groundwater flooding where you get river gravels. So you've got any big river in its floodplain, you'll have river gravels. Now you get groundwater flooding there, which is basically everywhere in the country. We're a country of rivers, aren't we? So yeah, the more local authorities, staff, we can be able to share what we know, share what we've learned as well. What works, what doesn't work, what can you do with very little resource? I mean, that's going to be the big question over the next few years, is with little resource, what can you actually do to help? What's the most effective thing that we could do? And I think we'll have answers to that question. And the legacy organisation we talked about, Let's Talk Groundwater Flooding, will have those kind of answers. How do we do this at the absolute minimum to really make a difference locally?
Yeah, and sort of the hydrogeologist role, as it would be, lead local flood authorities can't all afford to have their own hydrogeologist, but I feel like one of those roles shared across a local area of LLFAs would be a very good thing to have, and that's something as these projects we might see value in. But there's lots of other solutions as well. Yeah.
I guess it's what Jed is saying, though, that Let's Talk Groundwater becomes a kind of technical source support system. So at the moment, there's very little support system, and you have to be in the extra specialist rooms to hear some of this conversation. So part of it is normalizing the conversation, part of it is putting the information out there. It's not just the local councils, LLFAs, the communities are better informed. But it's also climate change, Jed, isn't it? Because to an extent, because groundwater has been largely out of sight and out of mind, of all the different flood types, it's probably the one that's the most out of sight and out of mind. With the rapidly changing climate, what you're finding is a combination of factors is putting groundwater more visible and in our conscious space. Its impact is getting much more significant. We've had issues in 2016 where we had some really significant groundwater floods on its own, but also groundwater flooding, like any other flooding, is interactive. And there's a conversation about how much effectiveness some of the bigger flood schemes are if there's an underlying problem that's not being addressed. What do you think, Jed?
Yeah, I mean, that's the complexity of it, isn't it? It's one thing on us singling out groundwater flooding as an issue to deal with, but in the reality is it interacts with other sources of flooding. And anything you do really needs to be taking a more holistic approach to flooding. And I think it is important that we address the issues that groundwater flooding has that are solely really related to that as a source. But then once you step back and you're looking at, if you're looking at a community that's affected by flooding in general, like for example, one of the areas we work with, Chesham, has a combined source for groundwater from the river and from surface water, and they all interact. Every time there's a flood there, it's a combination. So you can't actually really separate it out quite the way we might like to as people who work in flood risk. But I guess you've got to start somewhere, haven't you? When you're working with these issues, and if you can understand each one better, then you can understand the interaction. And I think that's what the gap at the moment is: the lack of understanding around where the groundwater is,
Absolutely.
what it does, how it responds to rainfall, and the climate change question is again a huge unknown. So we're expecting more rain as a general outcome, aren't we? And heavier rain. Now, and more intense storms. Now, does that equate to increased groundwater flood risk? You would think yes, but it's not been quantified. The research is not really there. This is again, there's another area that
That's
needs
the
looking
point,
into.
isn't it?
Yeah.
There is no research for the most part. So I guess with the other types of flooding, there are established schemes, there's
Yeah.
established data,
Yeah.
and I guess that's why I use the term
Yeah.
black art. With groundwater, where there's information, it's in isolated spots. There is no comprehensive, wide-reaching data.
Yeah, and I think again from a local authority perspective, you think about how we want to grow and develop as areas, there's a demand to build more houses, etc. And when we do that and we review flooding for surface water, you do apply climate change. But as well, sort of how can our projects help us better inform developers? How do we include groundwater flood risk in the same way we would for, say, surface water when A, identify a new site, but B, when we get new development plans coming forward, make sure that that's mitigated against?
Yeah, it's another big gap, Carl, in my view. I think we've got an element of our projects looking specifically at planning. And what we've found so far is that local authorities, the guidance you get to work with from national planning policy, it's not good enough, if I put it simply. It gives you a kind of starting point, but what you lack is data to build your policy on. And then without the data, without good mapping, how do you actually apply any of this to your local plans and your local planning policy? So we're going to try and improve that. But again, in the long term, what needs to change is national planning policy and having that level of data at a national level. At the moment, it's relying on local historic records, which are really, really patchy for groundwater flooding. So you're off on a bad starting point as a local planner, because you're relying on such patchy, inconsistent, and basically really poor data.
Yeah, and again, you can only go off the information that's there as well. It's very awkward if through the planning process to make a decision based on assumptions. You'll get challenged on that, and I think the more confidence we have in the information with relation to groundwater flooding, the more assured we can be on where we move forward with development in the future.
I think also is the part it plays when we look at SUDs.
Yeah,
I mean, we love SUDs when we talk about planning, don't we? And groundwater can be a massive contributor to whether a SUDS is viable or not.
Yeah, and again, on one of the projects I've worked on recently, there's been a basin excavated, but that's actually resulted in water issuing, and we've had to line it. And again, just because we didn't have those particular records at the time, the water table was much lower when we did our pre-construction investigations. But this is in an area where we have done more research than probably most regions with the coal authority to identify areas of higher risk, but even that doesn't identify everything. So while we were kind of ahead of the curve on it, we still found issues.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And you describe a really good example there of where you just haven't got a good base data to start with. Down in the Chilterns, there's really, really good large, long scale records for boreholes, but they're put in for water abstraction purposes. So they're really measuring the other end of when it gets too low in the aquifer. So, and the impact that has on chalk streams, for example, is really significant. Like over the last few years, there's been a real drive to reduce the amount that water companies take from the aquifer, so reducing their abstraction, which has been really successful in restoring some of the chalk streams and the ecology, which is super important. But then the data looking at the flip side of, well, okay, so we've reduced abstraction. Does that mean there's going to be more flooding from groundwater? We don't know. Again, because how do you work it out? Because the data isn't there to, really model it properly, right? So all you can do is monitor it and see, and then you'll have the data going forward. And, we're working with the local water companies in 2 locations on that exact question. All you can do is go with what you've got, can't you? And then try and build from there. But at least we've got this opportunity of really raising all these questions now, haven't we? And pointing out that these problems are here and have been for a long time, but just been put on the too difficult pile.
Yeah. I think that's the interesting bit, though, and fair point that you brought it up, that we have been monitoring groundwater in this country for some time, but it's predominantly focused on managing the chalk streams and controlling abstraction. So it's a complete flip side to what we're trying to do, which is around the other side of it, is when there's too much and it's coming out of the ground. And the skill sets that we overwhelmingly kind of, with hydrogeologists, is we know several hydrologists that work in that space. But this particular space where you're looking at the flooding consequence is one that has been largely, like you said, Jed, in the too difficult box. But yes, we look forward to what happens with Project Bucks. I think Project Groundwater Buckinghamshire, as part of our partnership, Let's Talk Groundwater as well. Plenty to look forward to. And we'll obviously share more about your project and your website alongside this episode as well. And yes, in the meantime, though, thank you so much for your time, Jed. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the PGN podcast today. We hope you found it informative and enjoyable. If you did, please like and subscribe to the podcast. But also, please, if you find this useful to anyone else, pass it on and spread the word.
To find out more about Project Groundwater Northumbria, please visit www.pgn.org.uk.